You may proceed, Mr. Pretorius.
Thank you, Chair. Dr. Bloom, before we deal with the contents of page 12 of your presentation, I'd just like to take a step back. You will recall your evidence that in respect of certain advisory services, the McKinsey Consortium was the original appointee.
Correct.
A series of events occurred, the result of which was to introduce regiments to larger chunks of the contract, until eventually it ended up as the sole service provider for what was originally McKinsey's contract. Correct?
That's correct, Chair.
The question arises, in any of those steps in which regiments took an increasing part of the overall function contracted out by Transnet, were proper procurement procedures followed?
Chair, I'm unsure about that.
Yes, because that's not your area.
That's correct.
Yes.
Now, I just highlight that, Chair, to point out
Yes.
that that is part of evidence 2A, but we will incorporate it in the report
Yes.
2B,
Yes.
volume 2B of the report. But my instructions are that no procedures,
Yeah.
no procurement procedures or
Yeah.
open tender procedures were followed
Yes.
in each of those steps.
Yeah.
You've also told the Chair, Dr. Bloom, that from 35 million, the original contract price, to 265 million, at least a final payment, although it appears there were more, which you haven't dealt with in your report. Several steps took place between the 35 and the 265. Correct?
That's correct.
One of them was an increase of what you referred to as the success fee
Correct, Chair.
of 166 million rand. You have investigated how that fee was calculated, and with your experience and knowledge in the trade, as it were, you are able to give an opinion to the Chair as to how that was made up and whether that is within reasonable parameters or normal, acceptable parameters.
That's correct, Chair.
That's the task we're going to do now. Okay. So you say in the first bullet on page 12 that the invoice for 166 million rand, excluding VAT, was made up of two amounts. What were those amounts? We're on page 12, Chair.
An amount of 152.7 million, 0.8 million, for lead manager and debt originator services related to the CDB loan. And Chair, there was two other amounts which are combined in the second bullet, which referred to assistance regiments purported to provide for certain of the hedging instruments that we will discuss later.
The debt risk management instrument.
Correct. So there were specifically two of the instruments that we're going to discuss through the testimony that relate to fees or relate to that particular component of the 166.
And what do you say in the second bullet then? Second principal bullet there on page 12.
The one based where it says based on our financial
Yes.
knowledge.
Well, before we go there,
Okay.
you have experience in the financial industry, correct? And you've told the Chair that you have, and you must say yes because a
Yes.
nod won't be picked up. And you've told the Chair that included in your raft of experience is risk management, financial risk management, and the fees charged therefore. Is that correct?
Yes, Chair.
Right. So you are able to pass a judgment on whether fees charged are out of the norm or within the norm, and you are able to say what the norm is. Am I correct?
That's correct, Chair.
All right. So what is the norm? How is a fee for a lead manager and debt originator for a loan made up?
Okay, Chair, there are two components. It's normally a value. In other words, the amount to which the percentage of the fee, the percentage that is the fee, is calculated.
Well, let's deal with the first one, the amount of money.
Yes.
What is that amount?
That amount could also be two components, depending on what decision is made. The first component would be on the capital value. In other words, for instance, if you applying for a home loan and you take, and it's 1,000 rand or 1,000,000 rand or whatever the case may be, and somebody's taking a fee, which is a percentage, it would be a percentage of that. That's the capital value.
The original capital value loaned.
Correct. It's also referred to in the trade as notional.
So the
notional
first
value.
term of art, we'll get to hedging later, but the first term of art is notional.
Correct, Chair.
In any loan, it's the original capital amount of that loan excluding interest.
That's correct, Chair.
Okay? So that's notional.
Just so that I understand that part, are you saying when one is dealing with fees for a lead manager and debt originator of a loan in this context, one of the first things to know is what is the capital amount of the loan?
Correct, Chair.
And maybe depending on a number of things, you might have to bear that in mind because the fee might be, or a component of the fee might be linked to the amount of the loan.
That's correct, Chair.
Okay, all
So,
right.
of course, you said there were two matters to bear in mind when one deals with the amount. You've told the chair that what one does when one calculates a fee is one has an amount and one applies a percentage then to that amount. So my fee, for example, would be 1% of that amount.
That's correct, Chair.
Now, you've also told the chair that one could use the original capital value of the loan, notional, as the amount to which one applies the percentage.
That's correct.
But you could use something else. What is that?
Chair, that is...
I'm sorry, before that,
No, fine.
the reference to the original capital amount, is that the amount that ultimately gets granted as a loan, or is it the amount that your client may have asked you to get as a loan, but you might have got a lesser amount? The reference to original, what does it relate to?
Chair, that would be per agreement. In other words, if I was, for instance, sourcing a loan for you, we would agree that this is the amount of the loan, and that would
That I want you to get for me.
That's correct.
Yeah, 2 billion, for example.
Yeah,
Yes.
that's correct.
So when the two of us when I'm giving you a mandate, for our purposes, that's the original loan that we are talking about,
That's
original
correct.
amount.
That's correct, Chair, because that's what you're looking for.
Yes.
So that's my mandate.
Yes, if you only succeed to get me 1 billion instead of 2, when we talk about the original, it will remain 2 billion, and the 1 billion you got would not be referred to as the original.
That's correct, because that wasn't part of the mandate. The mandate was
Okay.
2 million.
Okay, thank you.
Is that always the case, or does it depend on the agreement between the parties?
It's got to do with the agreement between the parties, because what might happen is that the percentage changes. If
Now, let's not go to
if
the
I'm-
percentage.
or
The
the
chair is
fee.
just talking about the notional or the original amount of the loan. Is it always what is mandated, or could it be what loan was actually received?
It would be on the loan that's actually received, because that was what you were able to achieve.
No, but now you've said two things to the chair, so let's go back a step. When you talk about a fee. You talk about an amount of money on the one hand and a percentage applied to that amount of money.
Correct.
Right. So let's leave aside the percentage applied for the moment, and let's just look at the basic amount of money to which you apply your fee. The chair asked you, that amount of money, is it what I as the borrower want from you, the lender, in my mandate to the loan provider?
That's correct.
Or is it what the actual loan capital amount is? So the chair postulates a situation where I could go to regiments and I could say, listen, I want a 2 billion rand loan. You come back, or regiments comes back to me and says, sorry, you can't have 2 billion, but I can get you 1 billion. Right? What is the figure on which the fee is based?
It will be 1 billion.
Okay, so Chair, I'm afraid,
Yeah.
I hope that clarifies.
Okay. To the extent that the term of original amount may still be used, must we understand it therefore to refer to the amount that is loaned?
That's correct,
That is
Chair.
actually loaned?
Yes, Chair.
Okay. Thank you.
Right. Now, we are still in the amount of money box at the moment, or category, rather. The one amount that can be used to apply a percentage is the actual amount of the loan. There is another amount that could be used. What is that amount?
Chair, that is an amount which includes an aggregate of all the repayments made over the full term of the loan. In other words, it includes all the costs and everything that's involved with regard to that loan. It's referred to yield to maturity. That's just the term for it, but it's let's put it, if I can put it another way, it's a much higher value than what we were referring to as the notional value of the loan in the previous example. So this is the amount that is repaid and in aggregate over the full period of the loan.
It's capital plus interest.
Capital plus interest and over the tenure. But yes, we can leave it there.
So, what you have just said now, is it another way of is it another way of determining a fee for a transactional advisor such as regiments? In other words, are you saying one way of doing this is to say to a transactional advisor, I want a loan for 2 billion rand, you raise it, and I will pay you X percentage of the amount of loan that you get me.
Correct.
That's one way.
That's correct, Chair.
Are you saying, therefore, there is another way, and another way is that the fee is calculated on a different basis, and the different basis is you look at the repayments over a long period, including interest?
That's correct, Chair.
Okay, thank you.
Now, as we know from bond repayments, if I take the capital amount of the bond that I have to pay and I add the interest, I end up paying more than double for my home. If I buy a home for 1 million rand and I take the full amount of capital plus interest, I end up paying more than 2 million rand for it. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So the yield to maturity, as you've referred to, is a far higher amount, much higher amount than just the notional, the original capital amount.
That's correct, Chair.
Now, I can choose either, correct?
Chair, yes, it depends on what agreement is reached between the parties.
Yes.
But the norm in the industry is a percentage on the notional value, not on the higher value.
Right.
That's the norm.
And what? Sorry.
You mentioned a term for the regime in terms of which your fee is, as a transactional advisor, your fee is determined on the basis of the repayments. I think Mr. Pretorius has got the terminology already. I haven't yet got it. Something yield to value or something. What is that?
That's yield to maturity.
Yield to maturity.
Yes, Chair.
So that refers, the yield part refers to your fee, and maturity refers to the capital and interest over the period that repayments are made.
Chair, the yield.
Oh, that's quite convoluted, a convoluted way of putting it.
I think rather, when we talk about a yield,
Yeah.
we talk about the interest rate
Yes.
that's applicable over the entire period. That's why to maturity, over
Yes.
the entire tenor of the loan.
Yes.
So
So it's interest over that whole long period of repayment.
plus all the capital.
Capital and, yes. Okay, thank you.
Okay,
Hopefully
let's
we'll get
just-
there, Dr. Bloom.
No, Chair, you're doing
Hopefully
well.
we'll get there. Okay.
Let's just confirm the terminology. Capital only, the smaller amount, the original capital amount you're going to refer to as notional.
That's correct, Chair.
Capital plus interest repaid over the full period of the loan, you're going to refer to as yield or yield to maturity.
That's correct, Chair.
And we will always refer back to the underlying substance of the terminology when we go through your evidence. So there are two choices. I can use the smaller amount, notional, and that's the industry norm, you say.
Yes, Chair.
But also it's not unheard of for parties to agree that the larger amount, the yield, is used.
Yes, it is used, but it's more the exception to the rule.
All right. Now,
If,
the next step.
before that, Mr. Pretorius, if I want to distinguish between the two correctly, I want to call them, it's regime this, regime that. The one would be yield to maturity regime, I would imagine. Would that be a good description?
Very much so, Chair.
And the other one you would call what?
Notional
Notional
value.
amount, notional value
notional
regime.
amount is right.
Notional amount regime.
Yes,
So we can have those two regimes.
that's correct, Chair.
Okay, that might not suit you, Mr. Pretorius.
No, it suits me
from my
absolutely,
own-
except as with lawyers,
Yeah.
financiers, it's not notional at all. It's actual.
That's exactly what I'm thinking.
You can be forgiven for doing so, but we will take it step by step.
Yeah, okay.
All right, so you have two base amounts. One, the smaller amount, notional, or the bigger amount, yield, or yield to maturity.
Correct, Chair.
One applies a percentage to either of those amounts to determine the fee.
That's correct.
So I can say, and we'll get to the actual percentages, I, as the transactional advisor to you, Transnet, I want 1% of the smaller amount or 1% of the larger amount.
Yes, Chair. Normally.
We'll get complicated now.
Okay.
One would imagine, however, that there are also industry norms about the amount of that percentage or the size of that percentage one applies. Is that correct?
Yes, Chair.
And you're aware of those,
That's correct.
and you're going to tell the chair about those in a moment. But just at a conceptual level, if we may, conceptual level, just at a conceptual level, one would imagine that if one is using the smaller amount, the percentage would be bigger.
That's correct.
And if one was using the larger amount, the percentage would be smaller.
That's correct, Chair.
What happened here?
Chair, if we can maybe look at the numbers, that will be adequate for the explanation on slide 12.
There's a diagram on slide 12, Chair, which attempts to explain this. It's on the page that you have before.
Well, I'm still on your question. You say if one uses the notional amount regime, the percentages should be what?
Smaller.
Smaller.
Within a range which is the market norm.
Yes. And you say if you use the yield to maturity regime, it should be bigger,
A smaller percentage.
smaller than if you use
Yes.
Okay, maybe Dr. Bloom, can you explain that to me? Why?
Yes, Chair, because the value, the notional value is a lot smaller, if one wants to put it that way, than the yield to maturity regime. In other words, it's a much smaller number because, remember, as we discussed, the yield to maturity includes all the repayments and all of that over the maturity.
Smaller in terms of the rand, of the amount, not smaller in terms of the percentage.
That's correct, Chair, and that's why the percentage has become important.
I thought it was in relation to a percentage. The percentage could be the same, but because the amounts are different, one is higher than another one, the actual amount received would be different.
That's correct, Chair.
Yeah.
So, by way of example, if there is a loan of 100 rand, 1% would be 1 rand.
That's correct, Chair.
That's notional. If at the end of the day I finally end up paying 200 rand, but I still want 1%, what am I paid?
2.
2 rand. All right, so let's deal with your diagram, or the diagram that we've discussed, if we may.
Chair, the diagram relates directly to the 1.5 billion rand loan from the CDB. On the
But you've translated that into rand.
yes, correct.
Okay.
So let's start with the right-hand column, if we can. The notional over there is 18 billion rand. So in other words, that represents the 1.5 billion US dollar loan from the China Development Bank. That in rand terms, it's 18 billion. Just by the way, Chair, this is the information that regiments used in the calculation of their fees, so that we can just align as well.
Right. So, in actual fact, the 166 million rand, at least in large part, fee was calculated as you've set out here. It was based on notional. Well, that's going too far too fast.
Yes.
I'm sorry. We start with a notional. That's the basic amount of the loan, original capital.
Correct, Chair. This is merely by way of example that the notional is included here, because the way regiments did the calculation was on the yield to maturity. So essentially, if we can move then to the left-hand portion of the diagram, the yield to maturity of that 1.5 billion dollar loan was 102 billion rand.
So that's capital plus interest over the full period of the loan.
Full duration maturity.
Just repeat that, about 102 billion rand
So the 102 billion rand
is based on the yield to maturity
is the
regime.
yield. It is the yield to maturity.
It is a yield to maturity. Yeah.
Correct, Chair.
Yeah.
What happened then was regiments took.
Let's say what the norm is first. The norm would be, if you're going to use 18 billion rand, what is the industry norm in relation to the percentage that you would apply to 18 billion rand?
Chair, that differs what the market is, what the market dictates, and who you're talking to, and whose pricing you're comparing with who, et cetera. So to say this is what the percentage would be is almost
It's
impossible.
difficult, yeah.
Correct. So
But you would be able to say, I would imagine, that below a certain percentage would be hard to get.
correct.
To get somebody who would charge below a certain percentage, and it should be possible to say it would be very extraordinary to find somebody who charges above a certain percentage.
That's correct, Chair.
So somewhere in between, then you could have what you regard as more or less not shocking.
Yes, Chair. So at the time when these transactions were ongoing, the basic rates that one could achieve, or the percentages fees that one could achieve in the market, was between more or less 0.2% and 0.5%.
So the norm is, if you take the lesser amount, you could achieve between 0.2 and 0.5%. So that's the right-hand column.
That's correct, Chair.
Is the norm.
That's correct, at the time of the transaction.
Now, please tell the Chair, if you used the yield, the higher amount, the 102 billion rand, what percentage could one apply as the norm?
Chair, that would be about 0.01%. It would be 0.01% or less. This is not what's stated over there, but Advocate Pretorius has asked what is the norm.
Yes.
So if we compare what is stated over there, 0.15%,
Yes.
to what the norm would be, which is 0.01%, this is 0.14% more.
Okay.
All right, so if we want to, let's just have this picture reflect the norm to start with, because the right-hand column reflects the norm, correct?
Yep.
So in that box, underneath ZAR 102 billion, if we want to see the norm, let's put 0.01%. Correct?
Yes, Chair.
Okay, so we now have a picture, Chair. If you're going to use the bigger amount, if you want to be more or less within the norm of
The
102
notional
billion,
regime.
you would use a factor of 0.01.
Yes.
If you were going to use the lesser one, 18 billion, one would, within normal parameters, use 0.2 and 0.5, which is a far higher percentage than 0.01. Okay? We're on the same page
That's
so
correct,
far.
Chair. Yes.
What did regiments do?
Regiments applied 0.15% to the yield to maturity, which is a rounded figure of 102 billion. And if I may, if you do that calculation, then you would get to the 152.7 million that is stated at the top of the slide.
All right, but let's
more or less.
take it step by step.
Okay.
The norm, which you know from your experience and in your opinion that you're giving to the Chair. The norm is if you use the higher amount, you use a lesser percentage.
That's correct.
If you use a lower amount, the notional, you use a higher percentage.
That's correct.
And you're saying to the Chair, what regiments did was they used the higher amount and a higher percentage.
That's correct, Chair. Even if you want to, you can compare the lower percentage on the notional side, in other words, the 0.2, compare that to the 0.15. It's only slightly less, but the basis on which it was applied was substantially different.
So let's just summarize there. You have a higher amount and a lower amount as the base on which you apply your percentage to calculate a fee.
That's correct, Chair.
If you use the lower amount, the norm says you can use the higher percentage.
That's correct.
If you use the higher amount, the norm says then you must use a lower percentage. Logical.
Yeah.
What regiments did was to use the higher amount and a percentage beyond market norms.
That's correct, Chair.
Is that correct? All right. So you explain that then on page 13.
That's right, Chair.
And you say that the fee regiments charged, 0.15 on yield, is equivalent to 0.85 on the notional amount of 18 billion.
That's correct.
And if one goes back a page, you'll see the norm there is 0.2 to 0.5.
That's correct.
And if you do the math, they were 0.85 if one bases it on the notional amount of 18 billion. In short, what you're saying is that it was beyond market norms.
Yes, Chair, well beyond market norms.
Well beyond market norms, and you tell us by how much you estimate that to be on page 13. So if you would just take the chair through page 13, please.
Yes, Chair. So, as was indicated by Advocate Pretorius, the 0.15%, which we know of on the yield, is equivalent to this 0.85% percentage on the notional value, which is the 18 billion that we've used. The second point refers to the market conventions and Transnet practices to pay lead arrangement fees on notional and not on the yield to maturity, as regiments did or claimed.
Let's pause there, because you have two sources of information on which you base your expert opinion, right? The one is your own experience in the financial industry, financing industry, correct?
Correct, Chair.
The other is your examination of what happened historically in Transnet.
That's correct, Chair.
Okay. And against the norms produced in the industry and produced in Transnet itself, was the regiment's fee within those norms or outside of those norms?
Outside of those norms.
Both. Both the Transnet practice and
Yes, Chair.
industry norms.
That's correct.
Okay. If you go to the third bullet.
So that is what we've been discussing. So based on on market norms or conventions, the fee would have been charged of 0.2%, between 0.2 and 0.5% on the notional value.
Okay, if you just go back.
I'm sorry, Mr. Pretorius.
Sure.
On market conventions, your point number 2, market conventions and Transnet practices are to pay lead arrangement fees on notional and not on yield to maturity as regiments did. Market conventions, wouldn't that be what we talked about when we talked about norms in the market?
That's correct, Chair. In other words, the fee that is payable is calculated on the notional value and not the yield. That's what's the norm in the market.
That is insofar as the lead arrangement is concerned. And as far as the debt origination, if I can call it that, and what's the market conventions and Transnet practices, or is that something you are still going to come to?
Chair, this was it depends. Lead manager and debt originator is in this particular case a consolidated term, if I can put it that way.
Yes.
So it depends on, if you're the lead manager, you are the debt originator in certain cases. But what we're referring to here is the regiment's requirement, or the regiments that acted as the lead manager and debt originator for which they're claiming this fee.
Oh, you know what I thought? You see, on page 12, we talked about that amount of 152.7 million, that regiments were to be the lead manager and debt originator. And here on point 2 at page 13, you say market conventions and Transnet practices are to pay lead arrangement fees on notional and not on yield to maturity as regiments did. I thought that what you meant is lead manager and debt originator can be two separate people or entities, but sometimes it's one.
That's correct, Chair.
But I thought what you meant was these conventions, market conventions and practices is that you are talking about in bullet point number 2 on page 13 relate only to the lead management role as opposed to the debt origination role, but you are now clarifying to say you meant a combination of both in regard to this transaction.
100% correct,
Okay,
Chair.
no,
That's
now
right.
I understand, okay.
And when you say market convention is to base the fee calculation on notional, the smaller amount,
That's correct, Chair.
you're saying that there may yet be exceptions.
Yes, Chair.
And if one uses, by way of exception, the higher amount, then the percentage should be much lower,
That's correct, Chair.
logically. All right. So what do you say then in the third bullet? If regiments was to use notional,
So if we assume that the market norms, or we accept that the market norms in that period of time were between 0.2 and 0.5%, and if you look at the first bullet, Chair, the equivalent, in other words, the 0.85%, that's what one would be comparing this with, which indicates that regiments charged excessively higher fees on the notional equivalent than what the market norms were.
so you take 18 billion, which is the original capital amount.
Correct?
Market norms say you must charge between 2 and 5%. On your calculations, they charge 0.85, which is beyond the norm, and that is a substantial amount, you say.
Correct, Chair. I didn't calculate it, but if one just subtracts the 0.85% from the 0.5%, one gets a good indication.
The next bullet you say, if however regiments were to say, as they did, we don't want to use the smaller amount, we want to use the larger amount.
Correct, Chair.
The larger amount being 102 billion,
Correct.
as opposed to 18 billion.
Correct, Chair.
Then the percentage fee that the market would ordinarily dictate would be what?
In the region of 0.01%. In other, yeah, as said previously.
Well, here you say in the fourth bullet 0.06.
Okay, let me explain that. What happens is if one reverses the calculation. So if we want to compare something, so what I did in terms of the calculation, I said if the market norm is between 0.2 and 0.5, and I took the average of those two, which is then 0.35, and I compare that, if I take that percentage as an assumption, and I compare that to what would that be? In other words, I'm doing the calculation in reverse. So how much percent would that be on the yield to maturity? Not the 15 basis point, the 15%, 0.15%, sorry, Chair, that regiments charged, but if through market conventions, then it should have been 0.06%.
All right.
And yeah.
I'm afraid you lost me there, and I'm sure the chair followed you to the letter. Let me take a step back, if I may. In the fourth bullet, you talk about market convention and Transnet practice. I would imagine in telling the chair what market convention and practice was, you're referring to an external norm. Do you follow what I say?
Yes, Chair.
So what would that external norm be if one was to apply the yield to maturity? You told us that a minute ago on page 12.
0.01%.
All right. So, in fact, we should correct the fourth bullet. If we're talking about market convention and Transnet practice, rather than your complex calculations.
No, Chair, what that 0.06 represents is not the... yes, from that perspective, you're right.
Well, it's not from that perspective, it's the words in bullet 4.
Correct. That would be, if the fee was based on yield market convention, Transnet would dictate a percentage of 0.01%.
Okay, so
That's right.
would you be comfortable if we took 0.06 out. I'm sorry to, my apologies for setting your calculations aside. We're here talking about external convention and Transnet practice. Now, whether it's external historical fact, you say that would produce a figure of 0.01.
Correct, Chair.
Okay.
That's the convention, market convention and Transnet practice.
That's correct, Chair.
Can we go to the
And
next point?
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, Chair.
The Transnet practice, is it always in accordance with market conventions? Here in what we are dealing with?
It depends.
I'm just trying to understand if there is any particular significance in always pairing them, the market convention and the Transnet practice, because if the Transnet practice is always in accordance with the market convention, then all one needs to know is just the market convention.
Yes, Chair. The Transnet, as far as I understand, and in discussions, that is what they do. They would use market norms and conventions in order to price certain transactions.
Okay, thank you.
And they had a skilled treasury to guide them in this regard.
That's correct, Chair.
But ultimately, are we amending that 0.06 on page 13 to be 0.01?
Yes. As I understand, you're comfortable with that.
I'm comfortable with that, Chair, but I think we shouldn't lose sight of the 0.06%.
For a different point.
For a different point.
All right.
Correct.
Come back
But
to
you'll make that point in due course.
Yes, Chair.
But here we can say 0.01.
Correct, Chair.
Okay, all right.
And what in fact did regiments charge
0.1
on the higher amount yield?
0.15%.
Now, was that within market norms?
No, Chair.
Was it slightly out? Or?
If one compares 0.01% to 0.15%, it doesn't sound like a big difference, but on a very large amount, it makes a substantial difference.
Well,
so that's
correct me if I'm wrong, it's 15 times the amount.
That's correct.
That must be quite high.
Yes, Chair.
Let me ask you this question, and it's part of me trying to look at this with as much benefit of your knowledge as possible. Would this be shocking to somebody who is familiar with the market convention?
I believe so, Chair.
Okay, thank you.
Of course, the question that we will ask in due course, who made these decisions? Why did they make them? When did they make them, and for whose benefit? We begin to deal with those questions in future pages. Right, so in the 6th bullet, you come to a conclusion. And what do you say there?
That, Chair, that regiments charged a fee that is not nearly in line with market conventions and Transnet practice.
Actually, when you say not in line, you're being kind to them, isn't it? Way out of line.
Yes, it's way out of line, Chair. That's correct.
Yeah.
Well, one way of looking at it is 15 times more than it should.
Yes, Chair.
And you've put an estimate on that. We needn't go to how you calculated that because we've got enough maths to do as we go along. What is in your opinion, the overcharge estimated to be?
Chair, based on and these calculations, as I indicated previously, are based on the data that regiments used in their calculation of the fee. So if you look at it from the perspective of they charged 152.7 million, and you use what they did and you converted, then they were overcharged by 90 million. In other words, 152.7 minus the 90 is what the fee should have been, based on the data that they used. But that, as we've determined, that is well beyond market convention.
All right, let's go to the last bullet. You qualify everything that you've told the chair up to now. If you do the math, there's an overcharge in your estimate and in your opinion of 90 million rand.
Correct, Chair.
But what is the point you make finally on page 13?
Chair, this relates, the last point is that Regimen should not have been paid any fee for this work because, as we determined previously, there was sufficient capacity and knowledge and skill within the Transnet funding department, or the debt raising department as it was then, to perform the required function. So in my opinion, there was no need for Transnet to actually outsource this function to an external party.
Okay.
That is the overall point you make, and then the other point is the one that you have been dealing with, I think, is even if there was justification to give regiments this work to do, there was no justification for charging the amounts that they charged.
That's correct, Chair.
That's correct, yeah. Now, in terms of what you consider to be in excess of what the norm was, of what they should have paid, or what one could expect to be an advisor in their position to have been paid for this kind of work, is there anything that you came across in terms of documentation that says to you, maybe they can come up with some justification? Or is it one of those situations where you are able to say, there is just no way in which anybody can justify this kind of amount for this kind of work?
Chair, I never came across any documentation which purported to indicate, that there was insufficient capacity, or that these are the types of fees that could be charged for the nature and the scope of the work that was being done.
Okay, thank you.
Let's just summarize to the analysis that you've done up to now. To which loan did that relate? Remember, we had the $2.5 billion split into 1.5 and 1 billion, right? And then we had further amounts. When we're talking about the 12 billion club loan that you talk about on page 14, you have told the chair that the $1 billion portion of the 2.5 was shelved.
Correct, Chair.
And it was replaced with a 12 billion rand, which was then presumably more or less equivalent to $1 billion. Not really, but almost. The 12 billion rand replaced the 1 billion rand portion of the 2.5 billion.
Yes, Chair, the $1 billion,
Right.
which was shelved in favor of the 12 billion club loan.
Now that was a loan raised domestically in South Africa
That's correct, Chair.
from a syndicate of lenders.
Correct.
We'll talk about that in due course.
Yes.
All right, so you deal with that loan on page 14. If you could just tell the chair of those facts by way of background that appear on page 14.
Chair, as we've discussed, the 1 billion portion of the 2.5 billion US dollar CDB loan was shelved in favor of the 12 billion syndicated club loan. What is important just to note, which we haven't spoken about yet, is the duration of that loan. In other words, how long will it be till it gets paid off, which is 15 years, and that it was concluded using a variable interest rate, or what we term another, if I can introduce another term, Chair, the floating interest rate, which is the same as variable interest rate on the majority of our loans.
Yeah, some witness told me about a floating interest rate. I think there is a floating and a fixed interest rate.
That's correct, Chair. We're going to talk about that a lot.
Okay, all right, thank you.
So we know that out there in the marketplace, interest rates fluctuate.
That's correct, Chair.
Interest rates are determined in various ways. We have the repo rate, which is determined by the Reserve Bank, but it varies from month to month almost.
That's correct.
Right. But in any event, if you enter into an agreement with a floating interest rate, you pay a rate that is undetermined, fluctuating, and unpredictable.
That's correct, Chair.
And you've told the Chair that that's sometimes risky.
Correct, Chair.
For the borrower, at least.
That's true.
Okay, what happened on the 12th of May 2015 in relation to the club loan?
Chair, on the 12th of May, JP Morgan was named as the preferred bidder to lead, arrange, and underwrite. In other words, we can take those three concepts as one, if you like, for now. The club loan, and there was a letter issued and signed by Mr. Anush Singh, where he indicated to JP Morgan that they would be the preferred bidder for this work.
Right.
And
were regiments involved in some way?
Regiments was the supply development partner of JP Morgan, as indicated previously, and they were part of that process.
Okay, what happened then on the we go to page 15, on the 27th of August 2015?
That is when Eric Wood, who was the CEO of Regiments, and Mr. Petolo Ramosebudi, the Transnet Group Treasurer, they agreed to conclude the 12 billion club loan, and there are 5 parties that participated in the syndication for that loan.
So, as parts of the lender?
Correct, Chair.
And who were they?
Nedbank, that contributed 3 billion, Bank of China 3 billion, ABSA 3 billion, Old Mutual Finance 1.5 billion, and Future Growth 1.5 billion.
And then what happened on the 1st of October 2015?
The board committee dealing with this process,
The BADC.
BADC, approved the memorandum approving the replacement of JP Morgan with Trillion in respect of lead arranging and underwriting services for the loan.
Okay, now Trillion come onto the scene.
That's correct, Chair.
A month before, or in the previous month, September 2015, you deal with this in the last bullet of the next page, but let's fast forward that for the moment.
Mr. Pretorius, to talk about the previous month.
So, the previous month.
Previous, because we have...
So, on 1 October,
oh, yeah.
JP Morgan
Is
moves
replaced
off
by
the scene,
Trillion.
and Trillion enter the scene
Yes, yeah, no.
for the club loan.
I was looking at 27 August, so...
Yes, sorry. So that's on 1 October.
Yes, yeah, no, you are
But
right.
something happened that is significant for our big picture, Chair.
Yes,
A month before, or in the previous month, and that is dealt with in the last bullet on page 16. And that is contained in the volume 2B report. What happened?
That in order for Trillion to participate in the as part of in the transaction and also to become a service provider, Salim Essa became the controlling shareholder in Trillion in September 2015.
So Trillion entered the scene in October 2015.
Correct, Chair.
In the previous month, Salim Essa, about whom we'll hear a substantial amount in due course, became the major shareholder in Trillion.
That's correct, Chair.
Let's go then to page 16, if we may. What happened on the 17th of September 2015?
This was then prior to the BDAC
So
decision.
DCJ, must I pause there? Or
Maybe I'm just Mr. Issa becoming a controlling shareholder of Trillion happens in September, and Trillion replaces JP Morgan early in October.
yes,
Now that's what I wanted to connect.
that's correct.
Yeah, okay.
That's
all
correct,
right.
Chair.
Okay.
First bullet on page 16, you say what happened on the 17th of September 2015. What was that?
That was when the acting GCE, Mr. Gama, submitted a signed memorandum to BDAC requesting the appointment of Trillion as the lead arranger of the club loan, thereby replacing JP Morgan. A couple of days later, on the 22nd of September.
I'm sorry, before you do that, and you must just tell me if this is something you can't deal with, because it's not really, it doesn't have much to do with finances. That memorandum that Mr. Gama submitted to the BATC committee requesting the appointment of Trillion to replace JP Morgan, I would be interested in the reasons that were given for that change. So, but he might, this witness might not have focused on that.
Noted, Chair, and it will
Yes.
be in the comprehensive report.
Yes,
I take that
yes.
point, Chair.
Yes, okay, okay.
I believe that that memorandum is part of the 2A report, but I understand that when one has a sequence of events as is being presented, one wants the detail in that presentation. It doesn't help to have to go
Yes.
to other bundles to find out what one
Yeah.
wants. So I understand your
Yes.
concern, Chair, and we'll meet
Yeah.
that concern.
And sometimes you have dealt with something many months ago,
Yes.
a commission such as this, and you can't really remember, and now you want to connect the dots, as it were.
Yes. Well,
Yeah.
Chair, you only have to deal with hundreds of thousands of pages of evidence and exhibits.
And that's
No
nothing.
problem.
And that's nothing.
No, but we understand, Chair. I
Yes,
don't
thank
want
you.
to make light of it, but it's a real issue.
Thank you.
So you were at the first bullet on page 16, describing the sequence of events.
Correct, Chair. So then on the 22nd of September of that year, 2015, the recommendation to replace JP Morgan with Trillion was submitted to the GCE, and the appointment, as indicated on the previous slide, was approved by BDAC on the 1st of October 2015. On the 18th of November of that year, the club loan facility was signed by Mr. Daniel Roy of Trillion, Mr. S. Gama, who was the acting GCE at the time, and Mr. Gary Peter, who was the acting CFO at the time.
Now, this is the agreement between Transnet and Trillion. It's not the actual loan itself.
I understand that. I'm not 100% sure on that item, Chair. We just need to check.
No. Well, we know from your later evidence that the loan was actually signed on the 23rd of November,
correct.
2015, but we're getting there,
Yes.
because that date is important when compared with the events that occurred in December.
Correct.
So,
It's not go
So-
there yet.
so that fourth bullet point on page 16 is the reference to club loan facility agreement then correct? From what you have just clarified, I'm getting the impression that from the clarification you have given to Mr. Pretorius to his question, I'm getting the impression that that agreement was the mandate being given by Transnet to Trillion to say our relationship, this is what you will do for us and this is what we'll pay. That's what that agreement was about, and not about the actual loan.
That's correct, Chair.
Yeah. So I'm just saying, I'm not sure whether calling it a club loan facility agreement is correct, but it may be that it is. I must just, but you say it's the authorization, it's their appointment to perform this job.
That's correct, Chair.
Okay.
In relation to the loan
In
concluded
relation
a
to
few
the
days
club
later.
loan facility.
It may be that that's actually the title of the agreement, but we'll check.
Yes.
And perhaps in brackets in the report, we will
Yes.
describe it so that there's no confusion.
Yeah, no, that's fine.
All right. And then in the last bullet, you say what you've already told the chair, that a month and 2 months prior to these events, Mr. Salem Essa enters the scene through Trillion.
That's correct, Chair.
But let's move to page 17, where you comment on the fees charged by Trillion.
So, Chair, in November...
Now, let's just
Sorry.
establish this. Trillion is appointed in terms of an agreement dated 18 November 2015.
Correct, Chair.
We know that, and you will tell the chair in due course in a different context, that the loan for which it was appointed was entered into days later.
That's correct, Chair.
In fact, a few days later, 5 days later, correct? Okay. And given that its appointment is finalized contractually on 18 November 2015, what happened in that very same month?
Chair, Trillion, for the work that they purported to have done, issued an invoice to Transnet for a figure of 93 million rand inclusive of VAT, which they, as I said, purported to have rendered as lead arranger for the club loan. And I'd like to just clarify, even if they did not do the work, which I will further talk to a bit later, Chair.
All right, so let's just look at the time sequence, because that's instructive in itself, quite apart from anything else.
Correct.
It's appointed in November,
18 November.
on the 18th,
Yeah.
right?
That's correct, Chair.
The agreement is entered into on the 23rd, the actual loan agreement for which it is appointed to advise
That's correct, Chair.
and arrange.
Correct.
5 days later, in the same month, it issues an invoice for 93 million rand for being the lead arranger for that loan.
Correct.
Just having regard to the dates, and in your opinion, is it likely or probable that they actually did any work?
No, Chair.
You have on 18 November 2016, Trillion is appointed.
2015, Chair?
Hmm?
2015.
Yeah, 18 November 2015, Trillion is appointed. Then you mentioned 23 September. I'm trying to look for
No,
that.
sorry, Chair, 23 November.
November.
Same month, 5 days later.
23 November, yes.
That loan for which it is appointed to arrange and advise is actually entered into.
I'm looking for that 23 November.
You won't find it yet, Chair.
Oh, okay.
It is yet to come in a different context.
Oh, okay. So, but 23 November is when they issue their invoice?
I'm unsure
Or when
about...
the payment happens?
I'm unsure about the date, Chair, but it happened in November. I'm assuming it would have been around that time.
Yes, okay. Now, are you then saying, looking at the work that an entity performing the kind of function or doing the kind of work that it was appointed to do, and the amounts involved and so on, it could not have done work to justify that the kind of amount that they issued an invoice for.
That's correct, Chair.
That's what you are saying.
Yes, Chair.
That the kind of work that would have been involved in doing what it was appointed to do to justify an amount such as, was it 93 million, in your experience would have entailed, would have taken over how long in terms of, obviously it could vary from one transaction to another,
Chair,
but generally speaking.
Chair, it would have been months because if you recall, this was a syndicated loan.
Yes.
And there were 5 parties
Yes.
involved.
Yes.
So you would need to enter into agreements, loan agreements with all those parties, negotiate with all those parties,
Yes, yes.
et cetera, et cetera. And
Yes.
loan negotiations is not a overnight process. It
Yes.
takes time and number of iterations
Yes.
and so on. So from a timing perspective, these just don't add.
Yes. Is it possible that the work had been done by J.P. Morgan?
Chair, I can't answer
You
if
can't
the work
answer
was
that.
done by J.P. Morgan.
Or maybe would the position be that if there was any work that had been done already, it would have been done by somebody else?
That's correct,
That's
Chair.
as far as you can take that.
Yes, by regiments.
Yeah, by regiments.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
But not only can you express an opinion, I understand, Dr. Bloom, by reference to the time periods, and it would seem that that would accord with common sense, and at least to the Chair's legal experience and my own legal experience and the legal team's legal experience, but you actually looked at the documentation.
Yes.
It's not as if you're making your conclusions just based on the timing.
Not at all, Chair.
So what do you say in the second bullet by way of summary, having examined the documentation?
Well, that the appointment of Trillion was irregular. That's the first point, Chair,
Why do you say that, just in summary?
because Trillion weren't the party that did the work. In this, given the time frames and everything like that, they weren't the party that did the work. It was regiments that did the work.
All right, that's your second point.
Correct. And that's why it's irregular. In other words, they were invoicing for work that they didn't do.
And that had already been done, you say?
Correct, by regiments in that context, and that is why Trillion could not have done the work that they charged for.
And this is all part of the report 2A,
That's correct, Chair.
right?
So when you talk about work that had been performed by regiments, are you saying you looked at the documentation and looked at whatever else you needed to look at in order to form an opinion, and you are able to say that that work was actually done or must have been done by regiments? In other words, is it a situation where you say, look, it is regiments who did it, or is there a situation where you say it must have been done by regiments because the work was done, but we know that regiments was there?
Correct, Chair. If one looks at the situation from when the deal was signed, in other words, that Advocate Pretorius was referring to the 23rd of November for the club loan, all the work that preceded that would have been done because the contracts and the loan agreements, etc., would have been in place.
Yes.
So somebody must have done something.
Yes.
But it couldn't have been Trillion.
Yes.
You draw a conclusion in the last bullet on page 17. What is that? This is your opinion.
Chair, that the 93 million rand invoice that was submitted to Transnet by Trillion purportedly as part of transaction advisory services appears fraudulent, irregular, unjustified, and notwithstanding was the work that was paid, or the money that was paid to Trillion for not doing the work, and they further flouted Section 8.3 of the Procedures and Procurement Manual, as we've discussed before.
Remind us.
Which is the necessity to use specialist units within Transnet with the necessary capacity and skill. And this is, remember, we're talking about a loan here, so it would have been part of the debt raising department. So that was available. That skill was available to use.
Was there anything extraordinary or exceptional about this club loan that would have required the appointment of a highly specialized external advisor?
No, Chair, not in my opinion.
That's leaving aside whether Trillion was actually that.
Correct, Chair.
And we will need to know, compared to a team that you said Transnet had, which was internationally respected, from what I understood you to say. So one could compare to say what was wrong with using internal people. Was there anything special in terms of the skills and expertise from Trillion and regiments and so on?
Correct, Chair.
Let's move on then to a new topic, and here we're going to talk of risk management and your opinion in regard to how the risks that you've told the Chair existed in relation to these loans were managed, and what financial devices or financial instruments were used to address this risk.
Correct.
But as the Chair says, we've got to take a step back and explain what hedging, derivatives, risk management is all about.
And I'm going to just ask one question relating to what we have finished. In your involvement with M&S to assist them with the financial aspects of these transactions, you have not had the chance to, so to speak, confront Trillion and whoever to say, how do you justify this, and hear what they have to say, and you are able to say this is what they said, and just maybe I can understand where they are coming from, but this was wrong, this was not justified, or whatever they say just doesn't make sense.
Chair, I've had no engagements with any of the parties, except for Mr. Ramasabudi, but this was when I started the process in September, as I indicated previously. It was an initial discussion to try and get an understanding of how things fit within the Treasury, but also in terms of certain of the transactions. But that was only one engagement, and there was no further.
Okay, thank you.
Yes. That will be our task, Chair. I would like to heed the request of the Chair that before we start dealing with these specialist terms, we actually explain them. So if we may just deal for the moment with the second bullet on page 19, right?
Correct.
In respect of the China Development Bank loan, the $1.5 billion, and the club loan, the 12 million rand club loan, syndicated club loan raised domestically. Right? There's certain risks that the borrower undergoes. You're lending, or you're borrowing rather, huge amounts of money, billions.
Correct, Chair.
And because of the circumstances which prevail when you enter into that loan and the future circumstances that might prevail during the course of the loan, you have risks. Just summarize, please, for the Chair, what those risks are.
Chair, in the context of the transaction, there were 3 risks that were addressed, or that were mitigated. The first one had to do with the exchange rate. In other words, the borrowing of the US dollar funding from China and converting that into South African rands and then repaying them in US dollars. That related to the CDB loan.
Right. You're borrowing money from China, China Development Bank.
Correct.
You're borrowing the money in dollars. You're bringing it to South Africa, converting it to rand. Correct?
Yes, Chair.
When you repay, you take your rands and you convert them to dollars.
That's
so the exchange rates both on the receipt and repayment of the monies.
That's correct, Chair.
And the risk that you've told the Chair about is the fluctuating interest rates.
Correct, Chair. You want to try and remove the risk by using the instrument.
You take out insurance.
You take out insurance, correct.
For the moment. We'll ditch that analogy soon, but for the moment it's good enough. Okay. The second one?
Second one has to do with the possibility or the probability that there could be default of interest payments that are attributable to the borrower. That's called, Chair, that's called credit risk.
That's
And
where it's attributable to Transnet.
That's attributable to Transnet, correct, Chair. And as Advocate Pretorius also indicated previously, this particular instrument that was used here had a contingent component, and that meant that there was a further risk mitigation that had to deal with potential circumstances that are beyond the control of Transnet. For example, certain economic events, as we said, downgrading and those types of events that could cause interest rates to increase significantly and could place liquidity pressure on the borrower. So this is a mechanism to try and cover that. That type of instrument is a very difficult instrument to understand, and we will see later, Chair, that instrument was actually Transnet would not have had the ability or the capacity and the skill to be able to do that. That's why JP Morgan were involved with that particular instrument, but we'll see that later. And the last one, Chair, has to do with the interest rate movements, and this was only applicable to the 12 billion club loan. So it's important to understand that there were no interest rate risk mitigation that was considered for the CDB loan, but that was covered in the exchange rate as well.
So the fluctuating exchange rates, that's something that the borrower would be concerned about.
That's correct, Chair.
But the lender wouldn't be concerned about insofar as the repayments would be in the lender's currency.
That's correct, Chair.
Okay. And then in terms of the credit risk, I guess that would be, would that be the lender's concern as well as the borrower's concern?
Correct, Chair.
The borrower's concern from the point of view, what if I end up not being able to honor the agreement?
Yes, Chair. That could also, there's a flip side, if you like, to that.
Yeah.
And that could mean that this was a requirement
Yes.
by the lender.
Yes.
Because that protects by introducing this instrument, you
Yes.
would be protecting the lender.
Yeah, so I guess the more importantly is the lender that needs protection, but I guess the borrower also doesn't want to be in that situation where they can't honor
Correct, Chair.
their agreements.
Correct.
And then the third one is financial costs, also the borrower's concern.
This is specifically the borrower's concern, Chair.
Yes, okay, thank you.
So let's leave page 20 for the moment and go to page 21. In explaining the terminology, we're going to concentrate on, firstly, the club loan, the 12 million rand domestic club loan, and
Yes, Chair.
the risk that is addressed in this diagram and in your further evidence is the risk of fluctuating interest rates.
That's correct, Chair.
All right. So let's start, Chair, on page 21 with the right-hand diagram. Okay. There you have a lender, that is the club,
Correct, Chair.
and you have the borrower at the bottom of the page, Transnet. Correct?
That's right, Chair.
And you have the content of the loan. We will learn as a matter of fact, because we're only wanting to understand terminology which you're going to now use frequently in your evidence for illustrative purposes, but we know that at the end of November 2015, Transnet enters into a loan agreement with the syndicate to borrow 12 billion rand on a floating interest rate. Correct.
Correct, Chair.
What is the risk attached to that type of agreement?
Well, the risk lies more with the borrower because the interest rates, depending on the environment within which one's functioning, the economy, etc., may result in interest rates increasing significantly, placing further liquidity pressure on the borrower. So entering into a floating rate or a variable rate regime would be the risk that would be associated therewith.
So if Transnet at the borrower, as the borrower says, look, I've now borrowed 12 billion rand on a floating interest rate. I have no idea, well, research institutes can advise, but never with certainty. I have no idea with any certainty of what that interest rate is going to do, and I therefore am at risk.
That's correct, Chair.
So what does it then decide to do?
Well, then it can enter into a risk mitigation measure, which is called an interest rate swap, which is the left portion of the figure.
Right. But before we go there, let's just explain a term. Let's leave derivatives out of our terminology, at least for the moment. Transnet says, I want to find a way, using financial institutions, to deal with this risk. I want to mitigate the risk, or I want to insure against the risk. And I use that term very broadly, and soon we won't use it anymore. I want to hedge my risk.
Correct, Chair.
So what does hedge mean?
Hedge means, very, very simply put, Chair, hedge means that you're taking the risk away, or you removing the risk from a potential negative situation. But in order to do that, we'll get to that, it costs money.
Yes, it means you are guaranteeing against the risk, almost. You are protecting somebody against the risk.
That's correct, Chair.
But whether it's guaranteeing or something less than that, that we will get to here in due course. Okay,
That's correct.
all right.
So let's just deal with one issue that I think is important to deal with because it becomes important later. You can never guarantee the interest rate in the right-hand box unless you enter into a fixed rate agreement.
That's correct, Chair.
Now, the decision of whether to enter into a fixed interest rate agreement or a floating interest rate agreement is something you're going to deal with in due course.
That's correct, Chair.
But anyway, what happens here is that Transnet decide to enter into a floating interest rate loan of 12 billion rand, a lot of money. Right?
That's correct.
It cannot ever guarantee what the interest rates are going to be. It's at risk. So what it does, it says, I want to protect myself against the consequences of what I have done.
That's correct, Chair.
So whilst you can never guarantee an interest rate, what you can do is say, if things don't turn out well for me, I can at least put in place another financial arrangement separate from this to mitigate the adverse circumstances of the decision I made to enter into a floating rate arrangement.
That's correct, Chair.
All right. So what is important, because we talk about swaps, right? You talk about swaps. Nothing is swapped. That original agreement on the right-hand side remains the same.
That's correct, Chair.
Throughout, your obligation to pay a floating interest rate remains.
Correct.
So when we talk about swaps, we're talking about something entirely different from what that word might indicate.
That's correct.
Okay. Right. So let's go to the left hand.
Well, will that still, is that still an elaboration on hedging? Because I just want to
All right.
finalize
So,
on hedging.
all right. Hedging, broadly speaking, as I understand it, is what you have described as the act of using financial instruments to deal with your risk.
That's correct, Chair.
More particularly to protect yourself against the consequences of you having entered into a risky arrangement.
That's correct, Chair.
Right. So hedging is the broad term used to describe the taking out of financial insurance, isn't it?
I don't know why I'm associating the word hedging with like fencing off.
Chair, that
Fencing off. Maybe in that way, in this context, maybe it's fencing off the risk, I'm not sure. But I don't know why I'm associating it with that.
Chair, that's actually a very good analogy, because that's essentially, from the borrower side, what you want to do. You want to protect yourself, so let me take this money and enter into an arrangement that's going to take any risk out of it. So if I wanted to almost seclude myself, in a sense, if I can use that as an example, then I'm going to put a hedge around me.
Yes, yes.
If I can
yes. Okay, thank
relate
you.
to your
So-
analogy.
Thank you.
So if a hedge protects, a financial instrument called a hedge would also protect.
That's correct.
Yeah.
But a swap is one example of a hedge.
That's right, Chair.
Swap is one way in which you can hedge your risk
That's correct.
or protect yourself against risk.
That's correct, Chair.
Right. The question arises, of course, which we will deal with later, is why this risk should have arisen in the first place.
Correct.
But we'll come there. And that's, in fact, a central part of your evidence.
That's correct, Chair.
In fact, the question arises if you're now going to spend a lot of money hedging your floating interest rate risk, why did you enter into a floating agreement in the first place?
That's correct.
Because, Chair, you will learn that mere weeks after entering into a floating interest rate loan of 12 billion, Transnet commits itself to the spending of hundreds of millions of rand to put itself in the position it would have been in a worse position, but on a fixed rate basis.
Yes. And of course, I had evidence, I don't know whether it was 2 weeks back, about a situation where I think it was Transnet, and I can't remember if it was this transaction, because there has been an overlap of evidence where the initial arrangement was floating interest, but then somebody came from Transnet at some stage and said, no, it must be changed to fixed rate. But
Correct.
in that context, the witness was criticizing the introduction of a fixed rate, and I think indicating that in the context of that evidence, that introducing a fixed rate was going to put Transnet in a worse off position. But I'll hear, and we'll
Well,
try.
you will hear, Chair,
Yes.
that this insurance policy arrangement, this hedging arrangement, in the form of a swap,
Yeah,
was really very harmful to Transnet.
to Transnet.
It lost a lot of money, but that we're
Yes.
getting there in due course.
Yeah, I think you will just, the legal team will just have to, members will have to liaise with one another to see who was leading a witness, who was dealing with that, to
But
see
we'll
whether
get
it
there,
was
Chair.
not the same
We'll
thing.
get
Yeah,
there. At the moment,
Yeah.
we're just at the level of principle.
yeah.
Okay. You wanted to say something?
No, I think, Chair,
But don't confuse us, please.
No, I won't, Chair. I think you're referring to Mr. Mohammadi.
It could be, I just can't
of
remember.
Transnet.
Yes.
And I think my testimony is going to unpack
Yes.
a lot more the figures and numbers that he referred
Yes.
to, and with certain updates as well.
Okay, thank you.
So at the moment, we're just describing the hedging instrument. The fact that it turned out to be a poor instrument, which caused even more loss to Transnet, we will deal with in due course.
Yeah,
But for the moment, Chair, we have hedging as the utilization of a financial instrument in order to mitigate against your risk.
and a swap being a form of hedging.
A swap is a form of hedging, and we are now going to describe what a swap is.
Yeah,
So when one hedges, and in this case enters into a swap arrangement, one doesn't swap anything with the original lender. Your obligations remain fixed.
That's correct, Chair.
One can put a wall around that right-hand box, that stays the same.
That's correct, Chair.
So the lender consortium are sitting happily in their offices in Sandton, knowing that they're going to get their return, whatever the interest rate might be.
That's correct, Chair.
And you remain liable to pay it.
That's correct.
But
but
what,
I'm sorry, but they may, the idea that there should be hedging may come from them, or not really, from the lender,
No,
because
Chair.
they want some certainty that,
Not necessarily. I think it's got to do with the ability of the borrower to meet his obligations.
yes,
So, and also to remove risk, which gives then then gives further certainty in
Yes.
the context. So it's not necessarily that it would come from the lender as a requirement,
yes.
but if you take a view, or if Transnet were taking a view on interest rates, then that would be an important consideration
Yeah,
in the decision to either fix or to enter into a floating agreement.
yes. Well, what I was thinking, and I don't know if it has anything to do with the example of an insurance that Mr. Pretorius has been or used earlier. What I'm thinking is that, a bank might insist that you must take insurance when you buy a car, and they help you to buy a car. You must take insurance and can't start driving it until you have taken insurance. They just want to make sure that if something happens, then they will be covered. So I was wondering whether a lender in this case might be interested that you as the borrower, is it take a swap, or do some hedging, so because they want to be double sure that they'll be fine, or not really?
No, Chair, you're absolutely right. In this particular context, it would mean that the lender would cover his risk, or its risk, in the interest rate that's charged. So a higher interest rate would mean I perceive more risk in the person that's borrowing this money from me. The converse of that is where the borrower says, listen, but I'm a little uncomfortable with what potentially could happen going forward in the next year or two, or whatever the case may be, and that I need to do something about that to protect my cash resources. It's very much a cash flow and a cash flow issue.
Arrangement.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
And I don't want to stay on the point for too long or dwell on it, but you've already told the Chair that a lender may require a borrower to mitigate the risk of a downturn in the economy, for example.
Correct, Chair.
So that's an exception to the rule that you've just put out.
That's possible.
Yes. All right. So let's get back to the box on the left-hand side, if we can. We now have Transnet saying, I want to find someone who I can deal with to mitigate my risk of having entered into a floating rate loan of
That's correct.
12 billion rand. And those parties, Transnet on the one hand, and the party that Transnet will deal with are called counterparties.
That's correct.
In the terminology generally applicable.
That's right.
In this circumstance. I mean,
Yes,
the
Chair.
term is used elsewhere, but here that is what the term is.
That's
for
correct,
both
Chair.
parties.
Yes, Chair.
And we know that in this case, Nedbank was the counterparty,
That's correct.
and Transnet was the party seeking assistance, seeking insurance, or seeking to enter into a swap arrangement to mitigate its risk.
That's correct, Chair.
So, explain to the Chair, Transnet says, oops, I'm at risk, I need help. Correct?
Correct.
It goes to Nedbank and says, I want us to enter into an arrangement called a swap,
That's correct, Chair.
which will protect me from the risk that I've entered into.
That's-
I want you, Nedbank, to insure my risk.
That's correct, Chair.
How's that achieved?
Chair, there's normally, let's look
So,
at...
sorry, may I pause?
Yes, of course.
If one was to extend, this is where the insurance analogy fails, right? If I was to insure against any risk, for example, my car being stolen, I would pay a premium determined by actuaries and determined by the insurance company. And if the event occurred, I would be compensated for the loss of my car.
That's correct, Chair.
That's not how it works here.
No, there's a second leg to it.
Okay, let's deal with that second leg.
Okay, Chair, when the two counterparties come together and start discussing the whole or the potential of entering into a swap arrangement, then they would, because we're dealing with interest rates, and we're going to be dealing with that a lot through the testimony, I'd like to use that as the analogy. In other words, both parties would have different, or should have different views on interest rates. The one saying interest rates are going to go up, the other one's saying interest rates will go down or will stay more or less stable. So you have to have the two opposing views to enter into such a transaction. Now, when it comes to
Sorry, may I interrupt you?
Yes.
Here? when Transnet goes to Nedbank and says, please, I want to enter into a swap arrangement to protect me against the risk because I'm scared that they're going to go very high and I'm not going to be able to pay.
That's correct.
Right? Transnet wants a situation that it wants to pay a fixed rate.
That's correct, Chair.
So having entered into a floating interest rate agreement, it's now going to pay a lot of money, ultimately, as we will learn, to achieve a situation where it's going to, in effect, when all the books are balanced, pay a fixed rate.
That's correct, Chair.
So what is swapped is the cash flow arising out of a floating interest rate with a fixed rate. Now, that may be going too fast, so you've got to unpack that slowly, please.
Okay. So, Chair...
But before you do that, a swap arrangement would be between the borrower and like the bank, or who would it be between? You were saying earlier on when the two parties discuss, that's the borrower and who?
And a party, a financial institution,
A third party?
a third party,
Yeah,
that
okay.
would be interested in becoming a part of a swap agreement.
Okay, and usually that would be a financial institution?
That's correct, Chair.
Okay.
The point that the Chair raises is, for our purposes, a very important point. Because if you look at the left-hand side of the diagram, the left-hand box, counterparty Transnet and counterparty Nedbank entered into arrangement completely separate from the static arrangement on the right-hand side, the loan.
That's correct, Chair.
Nedbank, as counterparty to the swap arrangement, has nothing to do with the consortium of lenders in the right-hand box. It's an entirely separate third party.
That's correct, Chair. In this particular instance, they were also part of the lending.
Yes, but
But
notionally, and I'm sorry to use that word, because I'm now using it in the correct sense, notionally they are separate.
Correct.
Correct?
That's right.
And the transaction in the right-hand box remains intact.
That's correct, Chair.
Nothing is swapped in or out.
No.
Correct? In the left-hand box, however, it's an entirely separate financial arrangement with entirely different financial obligations that are not dependent in any way on the financial obligations in the original loan agreement in the right-hand box.
Correct.
Okay. So we're dealing with a separate arrangement with not separate parties, but Transnet with a different hat on. It's now protecting itself against risk.
That's right, Chair.
And a counterparty who's entering into an arrangement to deal with Transnet in that aim.
Correct.
And the aim in this case, in the swap arrangement, which is a hedging instrument, would be for Transnet to be in a position where it knows and has certainty about the interest rate it will pay. In other words, akin to a fixed interest rate.
That's correct, Chair.
All right, so you tell us then, please, how this deal is structured and how it works.
So, Chair, because there are two parties, the one has to pay, because Transnet want to enter into the fixed rate, in other words, or assume a fixed rate on the, in this particular context, they would pay the interest using the fixed rate to the counterparty Nedbank.
Sorry, you said they would pay the interest. You must be careful here. They're not paying the interest that arises from the agreement between the lender and the borrower in the right-hand box.
They're paying the fixed rate.
They're paying a fixed rate.
A fixed rate.
Not the fixed rate.
Yeah.
The fixed rate belongs,
In this context.
they're paying a fixed rate negotiated between Nedbank and Transnet.
Correct.
They're paying an amount equivalent to a fixed rate. Yes.
That's right.
But let's not get into that detail.
And Chair, Nedbank would do the same. In this particular case, they would be paying the floating rate. So they would have the view that interest rates would remain stable or might increase slightly, or whatever the case may be. So that would, as I indicated previously, they have to have opposing views in how interest rates would move. But what is important to understand, it says there pays the floating rate and Transnet pays the fixed rate. They don't literally pay the rates to each other. Because we're talking about an amount. You would calculate the amount using the floating rate, and you would calculate the amount using the fixed rate, and you would subtract them from each other. And depending on how the interest rates have moved, only the net portion, the net part of that amount, would be paid to either of the parties. Does that make sense?
Well, let's go back to the role players.
Okay.
You have Transnet wanting to borrow 12 billion rand. And then you have a consortium that is prepared to lend 12 billion rand to Transnet.
Correct, Jay.
Okay. They enter into an agreement in terms of which the interest rate that Transnet will pay will be a floating interest rate. Is that right?
That's correct.
Yes. Now, Transnet becomes concerned about the fluctuation of the interest rate. Is that right?
That's correct, Jay.
And wants to protect itself against that.
Correct.
That's where the hedging comes in, and the swap coming in as well as a form of hedging.
That's correct, Jay.
Now, normally, would the lender in the main agreement, if we can call it that, relating to 12 billion rand, the lender in that transaction would not be the one that takes part in the swap arrangement, or would it?
Jay,
in other words, if I'm getting the 12 billion rand from you, and there's a fluctuating interest rate that we have agreed, and now I want to protect myself against the fluctuation of the floating interest, I need somebody else to talk to, or can it also be you?
It can be the same, Jay.
Sorry?
It can be the same.
It can be the same.
Correct.
But what is the norm?
No, there is no norm in that regard. It depends on the transaction,
yes,
and it depends on the parties involved.
So in other words, you can say to me, well, we are agreeing on a floating interest rate in regard to this 12 billion rand, but should you want a swap, we can talk about that, but that would be a separate transaction.
That's correct.
Is that
Chair.
right?
That's correct.
It's important, Chair, an entirely separate transaction.
Yes.
Yes, an entirely separate transaction. So in this case, you have pointed out that Nedbank was a member of the consortium that
Correct, Chair.
was lending Transnet the 12 billion rand.
That's correct.
But it was also a party that was dealing with Transnet with regard to concluding a swap arrangement.
That's correct, Chair.
Okay, thank you.
All right. So just to summarize, in the right-hand box of this diagram on page 21, Transnet has borrowed 12 billion rand at a floating interest rate. Those obligations remain fixed for the duration of the loan.
That's correct, Chair.
Transnet sits down, however, and thinks about what it has done and says, but I think interest rates may go through the roof. They may go to such a high level that it's going to put us in financial difficulty. Correct?
Correct.
So it says, I need to find someone, a counterparty, in this case Transnet, to enter into a financial arrangement to hedge my risk. Correct?
Correct, Chair.
It then sits down with the counterparty Nedbank. Now, Nedbank, on the
Okay,
other hand,
sorry, Mr. Pretorius, just want to make sure I follow. I don't know whether you made a mistake or I misunderstand. The way you put it, it was as if the concern would arise from Nedbank.
then I was wrong.
I thought it would arise from Transnet.
Yes, Transnet sits down
Yes, yes.
and says, did I say
Yes.
Nedbank?
Okay.
Late Friday afternoon? I could easily have said.
Well, I may have misunderstood, but that's how I understood.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, let's-
Okay. All right.
let's
So
not argue
the concern
that
should
point,
come
sure.
from the borrower.
Yes, the
Yeah.
borrower says, look,
Yeah.
now I'm thinking about it, I've entered into a loan arrangement with a floating interest rate. What if interest rates go through the roof? I better protect myself. So it goes to counterparty Nedbank and moves into a discrete separate transaction using a swap as a hedging instrument, right? And it says to Nedbank, on the other hand, say, well, your fear may not be so real. I'll insure you, right?
That's
I
correct.
will let you pay me the equivalent of a fixed rate, and I will pay you floating rate,
That's correct, Chair.
right? So if interest rates go through the roof, all you have to pay me is the fixed rate.
That's correct, Chair.
I will pay you the floating rate, and then you can pay your lender.
That's correct, Chair.
So Nedbank also takes a risk now in this hedging.
Yes, Chair, they do. If the rate, the floating rate starts to increase, then it's to the benefit of Transnet. Because remember, they said they worked on a certain floating rate. So if floating rates start to edge off or rates start to edge up, then that would be to the benefit of the party that is paying the fixed rate.
Right. So let's just talk about the insurance policy, the hedging, the swap, for the moment.
But before you do that, Mr. Pretorius, please don't forget the point you wanted to put. I just want to follow this correctly. You emphasized at some stage earlier that for a swap arrangement, it's important that the two parties should have different views as to what is likely to happen with regard to interest rates.
That's correct, Chair.
The more we talk about it, the more I begin to understand why it's necessary to have that. But you'll talk more about that in due course. But a swap arrangement would not be necessary, would it, for a borrower who, before entering into the main agreement, would have done his or her homework properly. Is that right?
That's correct, Chair.
If you do your homework properly in terms of what's likely to happen in the interest rates in the years to come, and you are confident of the assessment you have made, you would choose whether you go for the floating interest rate or the fixed rate, and you would then say, because I'm comfortable, I don't need that a swap arrangement. Is that right?
Chair, that
Generally speaking.
absolutely right, and that is
Yes.
actually a fundamental part of the testimony
Yes, yes.
that we will get to.
Because when you go to, in this case, when Transnet, having concluded its agreement with the consortium for the loan of 12 billion rand, when it goes to Nedbank, it then enters into a fixed term kind of rate,
Correct.
At
which
huge
it
cost.
could, at whatever cost, which it could have done with the consortium.
That,
Yes.
That's correct, Chair. And as I said, that is going to be a fundamental part of how
your evidence.
of the evidence and the timeline
Yes.
that we are
yes.
talking about.
Yes, okay, thank you.
Chair, it's 4:00, and I don't know what your arrangements are.
Oh,
on the
yes,
last
we
day
didn't
flight,
talk.
But I just want to highlight two issues, if I
Yeah.
may, at this stage.
Yes, I'll allow
You've
you.
raised a very important point, which
Yes.
is fundamental to the evidence to come, that within days of entering into this floating rate agreement, Transnet is entering into the swap arrangement on the basis of a fixed rate. The second point is the fixed rate in the swap is much higher than the fixed rate it would have entered into on a market-based loan. And the added point is the only party benefiting here, the only parties to benefit from this arrangement are the service providers who are arranging these swaps,
And not Transnet.
not Transnet. It's all at the cost of Transnet.
Yes.
So, Chair, the question arises is why was it done in this way? By whom was it done? For whose benefit? And those are the questions that arise in this testimony and hopefully will be answered in full by the end of
Yes.
the Transnet testimony as a whole.
Yes. No, thank you. We didn't talk about when we'll end today, but we normally end at 4 unless we have made other arrangements. Today we are going to end at 4, but we are not done with Dr. Bloom, so we'll have to continue on Monday. Is that in order? I know there is a
Monday
witness
we have
for-
a witness
Yes,
who must be called on Monday.
yes.
So it will have to be fitted in after that, and I will discuss it with you, Chair, having discussed it with the legal team's planners.
Yes, let me just say, I don't know what your plans are. What I had in mind, based on the understanding that at some stage you may have thought that Dr. Bloom's evidence would take 1 day. I was thinking that depending on how much more time we need with him, it would be good if we didn't break the evidence, but I don't know the other witness whether he is going to be here for a few days or he would have to leave.
The planning is rigid around that, I'm afraid, given the travel arrangements, health, and planning.
Yes. Because
may-
I was thinking from my side, I don't know, I was thinking if we needed, for example, another 2 hours or 3 hours, or how much more?
Chair,
What do you think?
almost a day,
Almost a day?
yes.
Oh, okay, no, that's fine. It's just that it would, it's a pity if we are going to have a long break. This
Yes.
kind of technical evidence, once you are into it, it would be better to go on and finish. But there are things that we can't disturb in terms of next
Correct.
week's arrangements.
Great, Chair, and we will, when we resume, review this particular
Yeah,
point. We
yeah.
make sure that we understand
Yes,
terminology to allow us then to refer
Yes.
to these concepts
yes,
as we do frequently,
yes.
because this swap arrangement
Mm, it's fundamental.
is fundamental to a
To his
point that
evidence.
the witness will make.
Yeah, yeah. Let us look early next week in terms of fixing the date when Dr. Bloom would come back
Yes.
as soon as possible.
Yes,
It
It
should,
will be next week,
yeah, it should.
given availability.
Or it can be sometime next week.
Yes, yes,
Or
Chair.
yeah, that would be very helpful.
Yes, it will
That
be.
would be very helpful, yeah. Okay, then we are going to adjourn now until Monday. Mr. Pretorius, I know you're not leading the evidence of the witness on Monday, but do you know whether he's likely to finish in 1 day, or should we start earlier than normal? You don't have any idea?
Yeah, 2 days have been allocated to the witness. 10 o'clock would be in order.
Okay, all right. We will adjourn then for now, and we will start at 10 o'clock on Monday. Dr. Bloom, thank you very much, but you will still come back to continue with your evidence. Hopefully it can be sometime next week before one forgets the part that you have given today.
Thank you, Chair.
But thank you very much. We'll then adjourn.